Today we're going to talk about the power off 180 maneuver. We're going to introduce it to you in concept on the whiteboard here, and then we've also got some really great footage from a flight that we did showing you some of the approaches you want to make, some standardized approaches for how you want to set this maneuver up, some of the errors that you might encounter, and how to avoid them. Today we're going to be talking about power off 180s. We'll be introducing kind of some of the things that you should standardize, the things you can handle yourself, and then some of the variables that are going to be thrown in and how you can address those and make appropriate decisions in order to end your maneuver satisfactory within standards. So the first step to any good power off 180 is a great pattern. You want to start at about 95 to 100 knots in the downwind. Right at traffic pattern altitude, the ACS stipulates that we begin this maneuver at TPA, 1000 AGL, and we want to be at about 3/4 of a mile to 1 mile off of the runway. So that's your beginning point. That's really where you've got to start. Anything outside of that, and you're going to be introducing external variables that you don't really want to be introducing if you can avoid it. After that, once you've flown your downwind nicely and you find yourself A-beam your 1,000 footers, so right here, A-beam your touchdown point, we're going to slowly bring our throttle to idle. Once we've brought our throttle to idle, we're going to slowly pitch back for VG, which is 76 in the Piper Archer. And we don't want to make it be an abrupt change. We want it to be a smooth pitch back to slow to 76. I like to say just hold altitude until you get to 76. And then once you're at 76, you're going to keep 76. After we've reached 76, we're going to introduce flaps 10. And at this point, all power off 180s should look the exact same. We should be, slightly past our 1,000 footers at VG with flaps 10 in, ready to begin our maneuver every single time. Because at this point, this is where variables start to come into play. And we've got to make decisions and assess where I'm going to start my turn and what other strategies I might use to get down to the runway. Because ultimately, power off 180 is just a throttle idle landing from the downwind. And so what we've got to account for at this point is the variables that are coming into play when we're trying to make this approach. So assuming that we have entered our pattern and flown it in the way as standard as humanly possible, following all of these steps, we're really only worried about one variable, and that's our wind, the direction of it and the speed of it. All right? So that's the only variable that's really going to affect us once we've reached that point of 76 knots and flaps 10, slightly past our A-beam point in the downwind. So the question is how do I identify the direction of the wind and the speed of it? There's mainly 3 different ways. When we're flying in the downwind, one that I really like probably the most is I like to look on the ground at the runway, and located off to the side of the runway on either the left or the right-hand side is going to be a windsock. Your windsock is going to be able to show you the direction the wind is coming from and, how much it's sticking up. You can tell the speed of the wind, and that can give you a really great rough estimate of about where the wind's coming from and what you're going to need to respond with as a result. For a little bit more precise information, we can also use the METAR. So before we go to any airport, we need to listen in to our weather information, either an ATIS or an AWOS or ASOS. And that's going to tell us the wind direction precisely. So it may say 140 or 180, and then the speed of it. So it might be 140 at 10 or 180 at 15 gusting 20. And then the last way is that on our G1000, we've got a really great tool, and located on the PFD just to the left of the small moving map, or just to the right of the small moving map, is a wind vector. And that points directly in the direction of the wind and gives you a readout of the velocity or the speed of the wind as the plane is perceiving it. And a really great time to look at this is that when we're sitting in the downwind, it will have a readout for us that's pretty accurate for what it's going to be on the surface as well. It might change some as we come in, but it's a really great way to estimate what we're experiencing then and what we might be experiencing as we come in and make this pattern, right? So those are the 3 primary ways that we can identify the wind and its direction and its speed, being the windsock, our AWOS, ATIS or ASOS, and then our wind vector on the G1000. So the first scenario we're going to talk about as you identify this wind variable is that you're sitting in the downwind, you've pulled your throttle to idle, you're sitting at VG and with flaps 10, and you've identified already that we've got relatively winds calm or gentle winds coming down the runway. You might identify that with a windsock that's relatively flat and not moving much. Or you might identify it with the winds being something to the tune of 160 at 5 or 170 at 5 or even winds calm. Or you might identify it with your wind vector on the G1000. As you're sitting in the downwind, it would be pointing from directly behind you with a velocity or speed of somewhere in the 5 to 7, maybe 10 knot range. So if you've got conditions like this, you've got relatively calm winds, which means that on a standard power off 180, we want it to look as much like a standard traffic pattern as we possibly can. So we're going to be throttle idle, pitching for VG, slowly reaching VG and introducing flaps 10. Once we're at about a 35, maybe 40 degree angle to our touchdown point, we're going to start a nice base turn. Our base turn should at this point be relatively squared off to final. We're going to continue flying it all the way until we've reached final, and we should be losing somewhere to the tune of maybe 300 to 400 feet on that base to final. Now, once we've reached final, we should be able to gently introduce flaps, have a very stabilized approach coming in, be fully configured at 200 feet AGL, able to aim for our touchdown point of about 200 feet before the 1,000 footers, enter ground effect somewhere around 65 knots, and then float to our touchdown point smoothly, safely, and uniformly every time. Now, if we don't do this, right, if we say we misidentify our conditions or we turn way, way too early, we might end up way too tight on the runway and having to slip and dive down for the runway, ending up with a very unstable approach on short final, entering ground effect at 85, 90 knots, where we float way, 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 way down the runway and end up touching down outside of our 200-foot standards. Then also the other mistake we might make is we might extend our downwind a little bit too long. So we don't want it to look exactly like a standard traffic pattern where we've got that 45-degree squared off angle every single time. We are going to need to make it a little bit tighter because we have to remember that, again, we don't have any throttle in these conditions. Our power off 180 is a power idle maneuver. So we can't quite extend all the way to that 45 because if we do extend all the way to that 45, we're probably going to end up coming up short. Right? And we'll be able to identify that pretty easily as we'll be on a longer final than we want to, slow, low, and ending up needing to go around simply for safety's sake. Now we've got a few different examples of this scenario of us flying a really good traffic pattern, flying a great power off 180, and then also some scenarios of us maybe overextending our downwind and or turning a little bit too early. And we'll give you the chance to watch those now.
So what was the target airspeed that you'd want to bring in there?
76 VG.
76, and that brings a good point. Whatever airspeed you're bringing into ground effect, that's going to directly correlate to the amount of float that you have, right? Just like on a regular landing. Here comes Andrew, he's going power idle.
Crossing midfield, left downwind 16, Sherman.
All right, so we're looking back over our shoulder. Not much in the way of tailwind here.
Yeah, it's about 93 ground speed, only 4 knots over here.
3 miles to the north-northeast.
We'll start our turn here.
Come straight into runway 17.
Go 1.
Sherman, traffic goes 587, short approach, runway 16, Sherman.
We have a pattern, Sherman.
And you can see where Andrew's eyes mostly are. They're at his aiming point because that's telling him
Traffic, Sirius 1240, Pop.
how he's doing. Is he high? Is he low? Is he fast?
Over the
Is he
freeway,
slow?
2,500 Decatur.
All right. So I'm rounding out this approach here. This looks pretty good. I'm looking ahead at my 1,000 footers. I've got an eyesight for my 500 footers, which this runway actually has, and that's my aiming point. I'm bringing it down to there. And this approach looks pretty stable. This looks great from here, actually. So I'm going to go one more notch of flaps. As we come in, we're holding 76. We're a little bit high. So let's go ahead and introduce that last notch of flaps. Our power is idle.
Minimums.
And I'm bringing it down. This is great. Stable approach. We're going to continue from here. Bringing it down. We'll be entering ground effect at about 70 knots, right? And it flares nicely all the way to our touchdown point of
Stall.
1,000 footers.
Stall.
Smoothly touching down.
Stall.
Even making a soft field touchdown there.
Woo!
All right, so flaps come out, full throttle. We'll do our touch and go. Airspeed looking for 60. There she is, and rotate.
German traffic, Skyhawk 86, Golf is 3 miles south. Going to cross over midfield, left downwind, 16, full stop, Sherman.
Sherman traffic, altitude 587, upwind 16, about to turn crosswind, going to be making a short approach, Sherman. Great. So Andrew held that stable airspeed all the way in. He was using his eyes to gauge if he was high or if he was low. He realized that he was a little bit high, so he had a method to get down, which was the adding of flaps.
All right, so we're A-beam our touchdown point, which is going to be our 1,000 footers. We'll bring our throttle smoothly to idle, and then pitch slowly for VG, which is 76. As VG comes to us, we will introduce one notch of flaps, and look back over our left shoulder, looking for about a 35-degree angle or so towards our touchdown point. We're about there. We're going to make a left turn.
Traffic at 9601, 5 miles
turn.
to southwest, departing the area, last call, see ya.
My airspeed's a little low.
Pitch for our airspeed.
Sherman traffic, 575, left downwind, runway 16, Sherman traffic.
All right, we're a little low here, so I'm going to turn towards the runway. This isn't exactly the greatest one.
Gator traffic, 152 Romeo, also cross over the top. Gator traffic.
Yeah, let's just go around.
All right.
Sherman traffic, those 587 going around 16, Sherman.
Say that one more time.
So why did you decide to go around?
So in that one, we overextended our downwind a little bit more than we want to, and ended up long, and it was pretty noticeable at that point that we were going to be low, so the decision was an easy one to go around at that point. We've got some traffic entering the pattern here, so we're just going to extend our upwind accordingly.
Cool.
And I believe he said he's full stop, so we're good.
So Andrew's saying that he extended his downwind a little bit long, and so that resulted in coming in short. So that can happen really easily if in your downwind you have a strong tailwind, right? So there's a couple ways that you can tell that you have a strong tailwind component while you're in your downwind. It's going to be your ground speed on the G1000 MFD. You have a wind component over here on the PFD. And then you also have your eyes. So your eyes tell you how quickly you're moving over the ground. So if you're downwind and you can see that you're moving very quickly, more quickly than usual, then you might need to think, hey, I need to turn from downwind to base a little bit sooner, because delaying it could mean coming in too low. So that was great.
So the second scenario that you might find yourself in is having to do a power off 180 on a relatively strong wind day with the winds coming down the runway. So you might identify this using a couple different ways. First would be a windsock that's relatively stick straight pointing down the runway. Maybe you'll use the AWOS or the ATIS, and it'll say something to the tune of 160 at 15 gusting 20, or 160 at 18 gusting 25, right? Then the last way you might identify it is using your G1000. That wind vector would be, again, pointing at your back, and when you're in the downwind, reading a speed of 25, 30 knots maybe even. In this condition, as we enter our pattern, again, we want to make it very standardized. Throttle idle, pitch for VG, flaps 10 at TPA, smoothly slowing down, right? Once we get to here, if we continue our downwind too far, it's going to be very similar to that scenario of overextending even on a winds calm day, and we're going to end up short, slow, and low, right? So under this condition, because that wind is pushing me away from the runway, I'm going to naturally have to cut my pattern a little bit tighter. So I may be making a turn at about a, say, 20 degree angle to the runway. It's going to come relatively early, because what's going to happen is in that base, the wind is going to hold me off of the runway, and as I turn final, I'm going to have a headwind that is really slowing me down. My ground speed is going to be substantially low, and as I come in, my ability to get to that point may be a little bit challenging if I've extended myself too far. But even in this condition, if I turn immediately A-beam 1,000 footers, I'm still going to end up high. I'm still going to end up high and fast, and pretty much no matter how much headwind I have, I'm not going to be able to touch down smoothly and safely on the 1,000 footers. So we will have to extend a little bit and try and make it look as much like a pattern as we can, but if we extend too far, we're still going to end up low, or we're still going to end up low and slow and having to go around. So the last scenario we're going to talk about is how this maneuver might change if we have a crosswind. And we'll discuss a crosswind coming from the right to left and then also one coming from the left to right as well on this pattern. So here's an instance where we can introduce another thing that you can do standard to keep your pattern and keep your Power 180 as uniform as possible. So one thing we like to talk about here is that in our downwind, whenever we have a crosswind, we're naturally going to be being pushed into or even off of the runway depending upon the direction of the wind. So we want to, in the downwind again, identify the direction and speed of our wind as well. So we can use the windsock that might be pointing at an angle towards or even away from the runway. Our wind from the ATIS or AWAS might be indicating something like 100 or even 280 at 12 gusting 17. And then our G1000 wind vector is going to be pointed directly to our left or to our right, maybe at a speed of 15 knots or so. In order to account for this, we want to think about what our reciprocal heading is in the downwind. So our heading in the downwind, which is in this instance going to be 340, we're going to bug that heading and we're going to fly the ground track, so our pink diamond, on that heading. That'll keep us at that uniform 3/4 to 1 mile off of the runway. If we don't do this and we simply fly a 340 heading with a heavy crosswind coming left to right, we're going to end up being pushed off the runway way out here trying to make this base turn and being slowed down by having a crosswind that's slowing us, and we'll have an extreme descent rate in this base turn, and we're going to end up having to go around because we're going to be low and slow. So we can standardize this a little bit by flying that ground track vector in the reciprocal heading for our runway, and then be able to identify, okay, which way is this crosswind coming from? Is it pushing me into the runway? Is it pushing me away from the runway? You can identify that using any of these methods, and then also you can identify it thinking about which way am I crabbed. So in this scenario, with my wind coming from 100 at 12 gusting 17, I'm probably going to have a relatively substantial crab where my nose is aiming a little bit into the runway. Now, if I had it coming from the opposite direction, and I'm trying to fly that 340 ground track, my crab is going to be a good bit off of the runway. Now, once we get to that A-beam point, we pull the throttle to idle, we pitch for 76, and we have flaps 10. Using this information that we've identified via our windsock, our AWAS or ASOS, or our crab, we're going to need to make some adjustments based upon the direction of the wind as it's coming at us. If the wind is pushing us off the runway, we're going to have to expect that when I turn my base turn, I'm going to be slowing down, I'm going to have an increased descent rate, and I'm probably going to end up lower and slower than I might expect otherwise with a standard headwind. Now, if my conditions are different and I'm being pushed into the runway, so I'm crabbing away from it, and say my direction is 280 at 12 gusting 17, this base turn is going to be very fast, and I'm going to be pushed very quickly from that downwind through the base and on to final. So how do I account for that? One, let's talk about this scenario with the 100 at 12 gusting 17. When I get slowed down in this base turn and I am going to have an increased descent rate, I need to make my turn from base to final a little bit earlier. And I may need to, in that downwind, accommodate as well, thinking I'm going to expect this slowdown and I'm going to expect this increased descent rate. And so I need to make my downwind to base turn earlier as well there too. Now in the reverse condition where I've got a crosswind that's pushing me into the runway, this base to final leg, or this downwind to base leg, could potentially be a little bit extended. We don't want to overdo it. We don't want to end up low and slow because we've overshot. But we can expect as we turn this base to final that we're going to be pushed relatively quickly on to final. So we won't be able to expect a good slowdown and an increased descent rate until we finally swing ourselves around and get on that final approach there. Now, in any of these conditions, we may have to use some methods to descend a little bit quicker or extend our flight path so as to lose some altitude, and we're going to talk about some of those scenarios next.
So when coming a little bit high.
Yeah, and just kind of show different methods of ways we can get down.
Okay, so we'll come in a little bit high and we'll probably end up going around still, but we're going to utilize some tools that we have in order to descend.
And 757.
And our goal here.
Tops here, boarding takeoff.
Alright, so we're at our target altitude. Target airspeed looking pretty good. Throttle comes idle.
Alright, that plane's on the roll.
Roger.
Sherman traffic RTOS 587, making a short approach, runway 16 short. Sherman.
Alright, so we're going to turn a little early here. Alright, so if I'm high, which this descent profile already looks high here, right, I've got a couple options. One,
Stall. Stall.
oop, that's nice. Make a really squared off pattern.
16 Sherman.
Really square that base to final. And start using flaps. Right? So I've got a really squared off base to final here. Square that final turn. And then if I'm still feeling high, right, I can use S turns on short final.
Lake Tech Settlement traffic.
Right, we're doing some S turns here.
Touch and go.
Losing altitude that way. We're going to bring it back in.
Sherman traffic, Skyhawk base.
And then if I need to, I can use a slip. So ailerons into the wind. There we go.
Minimums.
This looks good. Last notch of flaps. And we still actually are able to probably have a decent touchdown here. We'll be a little bit fast, but we got plus 200 feet.
Stall.
Just
Stall.
to the end of this line here.
Stall. Stall.
There we go.
Stall.
Within standards. Would you concur?
Yeah.
All right.
Sherman traffic RTOS 587 on the go, 16 staying in the pattern left closed
Stall.
traffic, Sherman.
Stall.
So Andrew showed us multiple different ways we could lose altitude if you sense that you are coming in high. Flaps, squaring off your pattern, squaring off your base to final, S turns, and the forward slip. So if you're high, don't just pitch down and start nose bombing it towards the runway, because you're going to build up airspeed, and we already talked about a build-up of airspeed is what you're going to bring into ground effect, and you're going to float long. So there's all sorts of ways that you can lose altitude.
So one of the final things we want to talk about is that naturally on this power-off approach, where we don't have any throttle to get us to the runway, it is a natural tendency to want to be high, right? We have tools at our disposal in order to descend, in order to lose altitude, but we don't really have any that allow us to gain altitude. So naturally, people end up coming in high and fast. Now, ideally, we want to avoid this by flying a well-adjusted, well-tested pattern that is relatively uniform and makes a nice squared-off base to final turn and comes in perfectly. But that's not going to happen every time. And the tendency that we see on stage checks and on EOCs is that students come in high and fast, they enter ground effect way too fast, and they end up floating way past their point. So we want to talk about some of the tools that you can use in order to descend early on so as to avoid that problem. The first thing we want to talk about is if you enter your pattern properly, right? We have throttle idle, VG, flaps 10, and we turn base to final, and you're starting to feel that you're a little bit high and you might be a little bit fast, maybe in that calm wind condition, or maybe in that crosswind condition that pushes you into the runway. What we don't want to do is turn immediately for the numbers. We want to fly a really nice square pattern. So we want to fly a good solid base to final leg and turn final squarely with the runway. We want to use all of that real estate in order to lose altitude. Some other things we can use is the introduction of flaps, right? We approach it with the attitude that flaps 10 is kind of a given, but we might introduce flaps 25 or flaps 40 a little bit earlier. We don't want to commit to flaps 40 too early because they're very hard. We can't really take flaps out. But if we're very high and very fast, that may be something we have to do. Our other options is S-turns on final. So if we're high and on final, or high on that base turn, we may make some S-turns on final in order to lose some altitude as we come down. But we want to still end up on the approach, short final, 200 AGL, nice and stable, ready to smoothly touch down. The other option we have is a slip. Now, oftentimes, this is a tool that is overutilized, I would say. Sometimes when we approach this maneuver, we approach it simply through the eyes of using a slip all the way down to the runway and slipping it into ground effect and trying to make that really great fast touchdown. And that's really what we're trying to avoid here. That's not a stabilized approach, which is one of our criteria for the ACS. We want to have the slip be a tool that we use. Say we're on final high and we need to get down to having a stable descent, we can introduce a slip in order to lose some altitude to get back down to our approach profile that's going to be that appropriate 200 AGL, stable, continuing to land like we want to. So we don't want to be slipping all the way into ground effect and touching down at a very high airspeed, but instead we want to use the slip as a tool to get back to that appropriate approach path. So the last concept we want to talk about is airspeed and how much of airspeed we want to carry into ground effect and our afloat in ground effect to our touchdown point. So ideally, right, we've flown our standard pattern, we've maybe had to use some of our tools to descend, right? But we oftentimes find ourselves on short final with a little bit of extra airspeed, and we want to talk about how much we're going to float and some of the effects of ground effect on this. So on an ideal scenario, we enter ground effect, say 200 feet before our 1,000 footers at 65 knots, and we can float perfectly to our 1,000 footers and touch down exactly how we want to. Now, that's obviously not going to happen every single time, but what we want to do is we want to be able to identify some of our issues earlier of being high, being a little bit fast, use some of our tools to get down so that we can hit that ground effect at 60, 65 knots and float to our 200 footers, or to our 1,000 footers. One error that I've seen a lot on EOCs and on stage checks is that oftentimes our students will be on a short final or maybe on a short base to final, and they are high and fast. They maybe have already introduced all of their flaps, and rather than using some of our other tools of a square pattern or maybe an S-turn or maybe even a small forward slip, they decide that in order to not enter ground effect 200 feet beforehand and float to their 1,000 footers, they want to enter ground effect earlier in order to float to their 1,000 footers by making that aiming point earlier on in the runway. Now, in theory, that's not a bad idea, right? You know, if I'm going to float 200 feet and now I've got a little bit of extra airspeed, well, now I'm going to float 1,000 feet, right? What the error is here is that it's a lack of understanding of what occurs in ground effect. In ground effect, when we are one wingspan from the ground, we have increased lift, and reduced drag. So if I'm short final or short base to final, and I decide that I want to nose the plane over to enter ground effect, say 1,000 feet before my 1,000 footers, right? If I do that, I'm going to be picking up a lot of airspeed as I come in, and I'm going to be entering ground effect at 85, even 90 knots sometimes. And when I have that reduced drag and increased lift, I'm going to float way, way, way past my 1,000 footers, as opposed to using some of my other tools to descend, getting my airspeed down to that 65 knots so that I can enter ground effect at the appropriate 200 feet before and float to my 1,000 footers. That's a much better option than nosing over for the runway and trying to, quote unquote, save it all in ground effect by extending that float time.
Really normal approach here, but carrying just a little bit too much airspeed into ground effect. We're going to go 1 notch of flaps, and we're about 30 degrees from our touchdown point, making a base turn. Approach looks pretty stable here. We're carrying about 80 knots like we were saying. And reasonably stable at this point, right?
Yeah. Nice
We're going to pull one more notch of flaps. We're carrying just a bit too much airspeed in, so let's go that last notch of flaps, right? And rather than using some of our tools, like the S-turns, like the slip, we're trying to carry too much airspeed in. Right?
Yeah, not necessarily unstable, just a little bit too fast.
A little bit too fast, so we're 80 knots, approaching our touchdown point.
Good weekend, Sherman traffic.
And we floated.
And we float, and we're still able to make a safe touchdown.
Right.
Right, this touchdown is going to be fine. But it's way further down the runway than we want it to be. All right, and let's do a full stop taxi back for this one.
Yeah.
Sherman traffic, this 587, going to be a full stop taxi back to 16 Sherman. Off at Echo.
Yeah, so ATS stands for power 480, is that you're executing, obviously, a power off approach where you are stabilized and you touch down within 200 feet of your touchdown point. So for us, it's whatever you establish with your examiner or CFI, whether you want to touch down on the numbers or the thousands, but you get 200 feet after that point. The tolerances for being short are 0, okay? So it's -0 plus 200 feet for the tolerances on the Power 180. Now, one thing to emphasize is always going to be safety, right? So yes, we want to pass our check ride. Yes, we want to pass a stage check or whatever it is, but we never want to do that to the expense of safety. So if it feels like you have that excess airspeed that we talked about, you realize you're floating a bit too much. It's like, man, I really want to hit that 1,000 footers, and you force the plane down. That could lead to, collapsing a strut, popping a wheel. That could lead to porpoising, right? And so never sacrifice a safe landing just so you hit a standard, an ACS standard, okay?
So today we've talked about the Power Off 180, with the main focus on standardizing it in every way that we can, with our standard pattern and our approach that looks uniform every time as best as possible. We also highlighted our key variable, the wind, its direction, and its velocity, and some of the tools that we can use and the approaches we can utilize in order to counteract that, in order to make a safe and stabilized approach to landing every time out of this maneuver. And then lastly, we talked about some of the tools that you can use when you find yourself high and fast in order to lose altitude safely and securely to end up at that nice 200 feet AGL point, being able to come into ground effect at 65 knots and smoothly touch down on our aiming point of the 1,000 footers. Ultimately, the approach to this maneuver should be the same every time. Standardized approach with slight changes as necessary, accounting for our primary variable.